The bright lights of the studio beamed down as the audience settled into their seats, buzzing with anticipation. Tonight's guest was none other than Barron Trump, the youngest son of President Donald Trump. Despite growing up in the public eye, Barron had mostly stayed out of the spotlight, until now. At just 18, he had recently given his first public speech at a major event, surprising many with his confidence and eloquence. The media had been quick to react, and now everyone wanted a piece of him. The host of the talk show, Mark Reynolds, was known for his sharp tongue in controversial interviews. He had a reputation for pushing boundaries, often challenging his guests in ways that left them flustered or defensive. Tonight, he seemed particularly eager to test Barron. As the cameras rolled and the show went live, Mark leaned forward with a smirk. "So, Barron, I think everyone is wondering, what exactly do you do?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. The audience chuckled awkwardly, sensing the underlying jab. Barron, sitting across from him in a sleek navy suit, remained composed. He had expected something like this. "Well, Mark," Barron replied smoothly, his deep voice steady, "I'm a college student, first and foremost. But beyond that, I've been focusing on a few projects that I'm passionate about." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Projects? Let's be real here. You're a Trump. You've had everything handed to you. What could you possibly know about hard work?" The audience murmured, some clearly uncomfortable with the directness of the question. Mark was pushing hard, trying to get a reaction, but Barron didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if considering his response carefully. "Well, Mark," Barron said, his voice calm but firm, "I think hard work comes in many forms. Just because someone is born into a certain family doesn't mean they don't face challenges. I don't expect you to understand that, though." The crowd let out a collective "ooh." Mark's smirk wavered slightly. He wasn't used to guests pushing back so effortlessly. "Oh, so you're saying you have struggles?" Mark scoffed. "Come on, Barron. Do you really expect people to believe that?" Barron leaned forward slightly, his piercing blue eyes locking onto the host's. "I expect people to think for themselves instead of believing whatever narrative they're fed." The audience erupted into applause. Mark opened his mouth to fire back, but for the first time in the interview, he hesitated. He had underestimated Barron Trump. The tension in the studio was almost tangible. The audience had gone from amused to fully engaged, leaning forward in their seats as Barron Trump effortlessly held his ground against the sharp-tongued host, Mark Reynolds. Mark, clearly irritated that his usual tactics weren't rattling his guest, forced a smile. He straightened his tie, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Well, Barron," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "it's easy to tell people to think for themselves when you've never actually had to fight for anything. Let's be honest, your last name does all the work for you." The crowd let out a few murmurs. Some were clearly waiting to see how Barron would respond, while others seemed uneasy with Mark's increasingly aggressive tone. Barron, however, remained unshaken. He crossed his hands in his lap, meeting Mark's gaze with a calm intensity. "That's an interesting perspective, Mark," he said evenly. "But let's talk about privilege for a second. You sit in that chair every night, calling people out, belittling them, pushing narratives that fit your own agenda. Does that take hard work? Or does the system work in your favor just as much as you claim it does for me?" The audience let out a surprised gasp, followed by a few cheers. Mark's expression faltered for a brief moment, before he forced a chuckle. "Oh, come on," Mark said, waving a hand dismissively. "Are you seriously trying to compare your life to mine? I had to grind for years to get here. I didn't grow up in a penthouse with gold-plated elevators." Barron raised an eyebrow. "And yet, here you are, one of the most well-known talk show hosts in the country. Seems like you did pretty well for yourself." Laughter rippled through the audience. Even a few of the crew members behind the cameras were smirking. Mark's patience was wearing thin. He leaned forward, dropping the last remnants of his friendly act. "Look, Barron," he said, his voice sharper now, "you're not your father. You're young, inexperienced, and, frankly, you haven't done anything that warrants sitting in that chair right now. People tuned in tonight because they're curious, not because they expect you to have anything important to say. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Even those who had enjoyed the back and forth now seemed to feel that Mark had crossed a line. Barron, however, didn't react with anger. Instead, he let a small smile cross his face, as if he had been expecting this exact moment. He took a slow breath before responding. "You're right, Mark," he said, his voice calm. "I'm not my father. I don't have to be. I have my own voice, my own path, and I don't need validation from people like you to know my worth." The crowd erupted into applause, this time not just polite claps, but full, enthusiastic cheering. Even a few people in the front row gave him a standing ovation. Mark shifted in his seat, clearly thrown off by the unexpected reaction. He had set a trap, but Barron had sidestepped it effortlessly. Still, Mark wasn't ready to back down. He held up a hand, signaling for the audience to quiet down. Okay, he said, forcing a chuckle. "That was a nice speech, but let's cut to the chase. What exactly is your plan, Barron? You say you have your own path, so what is it? What are you going to do that makes you more than just a famous last name?" Barron met Mark's gaze without hesitation. "You'll see soon enough," he said simply. The cryptic response sent a buzz through the crowd. Mark opened his mouth to push further, but something about the way Barron spoke made it clear. He wasn't here to prove anything to Mark Reynolds. The interview wasn't over yet, but one thing was certain. Barron Trump wasn't the inexperienced, clueless rich kid that Mark had expected. And the entire world was starting to realize it. The studio was buzzing. Mark Reynolds had spent the past 20 minutes trying to corner Barron Trump, expecting an inexperienced, unprepared young man. Instead, he had come face to face with someone who was not only articulate, but also completely unfazed by his tactics. Mark wasn't used to losing control. He adjusted his earpiece, likely getting instructions from the producers, and leaned forward with a forced grin. "All right, Barron," he said, his voice carrying a hint of frustration beneath its usual smoothness. "You've certainly got away with words, I'll give you that. But let's not dodge the question. What's your plan? What do you actually stand for?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Barron. This was the moment. Mark had thrown down the gauntlet, expecting Barron to stumble, to say something vague or uninspiring. But Barron didn't hesitate. He sat up straighter, looking directly into the camera, as if speaking not just to Mark, but to the millions watching at home. "I stand for the idea that people are more than the labels placed on them," he said. His voice was steady, confident. "I stand for the belief that you don't have to be loud to be strong. That real power isn't about tearing others down. It's about building something meaningful." A ripple of applause spread through the audience, but Barron wasn't finished. "I grew up watching people talk about my family like we weren't real people, like we were just headlines, sound bites, or easy targets," he continued. "I've seen how quick people are to assume they know you just because they've read a few articles or watched a few clips. But that's not just my reality. It's everyone's reality. Every day, people get judged before they even have a chance to prove who they really are." Mark shifted in his seat. The interview was no longer about just him and Barron. It was bigger now. "That's why I'm here," Barron said, his gaze unwavering. "Not to prove anything to you or to anyone else, but to remind people watching this, whether they like me or not, that their story isn't written by talk show hosts or media headlines. It's written by them." The audience erupted into applause, this time without hesitation. Some were on their feet, clapping with genuine admiration. Even the crew members behind the cameras seemed impressed. Mark opened his mouth, but for the first time that evening, he had nothing to say. Barron turned back to him, a knowing smile on his face. "You wanted to know my plan?" he said. "It's simple. I'm going to let my actions speak louder than my name." The standing ovation that followed was unlike anything the show had seen before. Mark's own audience, people who had tuned in expecting a typical interview, had just witnessed something far more powerful. And Mark Reynolds, the man who prided himself on having the last word, sat there in silence, completely outmatched. Barron Trump had done more than just defend himself. He had owned the moment. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. And hey, if you love stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode.